Being an environmentalist can be hard work, and the bar is always moving. So I want to give you some ideas of environmental things that you could choose to do, and I want you to count to yourself, how many of these would I actually do? I only have 8, so you won't run out of fingers, if you want to keep track that way. So the first idea is save the plastic containers you get with carry-out food to reuse them for storing other food. Is that something you would do or that you already do? Okay. If there is no recycling for a particular item in your town, say it's styrofoam or household hazardous waste or something like that, would you travel somewhere else to drop it off at a recycling center? Third one, would you buy a car primarily based on its better gas mileage, or even buy an electric car? After all, transportation represents 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions for the United States. Number 4, would you use the backs and the insides of old envelopes to take messages or for scrap paper? Okay. There's sometimes an overlap between environmental and cheap, so that can work out. Number 5, if you see someone throw out in the garbage a recyclable glass container, you reprimand them for not recycling. Probably very few people would do that, okay? Would you become vegetarian or vegan for environmental reasons? After all, food production represents 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, and a good chunk of that is beef, just beef. Would you save water and flushes by the adage, if it's yellow, let it mellow, if it's brown, flush it down? Okay. Before leaving the house, will you go through the rooms to check that all unneeded lights are turned off? Okay. So, and the stove, well, that's where environmental and old age maybe runs into each other. Okay, so of those 8, how many of them would you say you do? Yeah, 5, okay, so you have 4, okay. Yeah, if I counted for myself, someone online said 6, okay. We save plastic containers. I do occasionally go elsewhere to drop off recycling or, make a special trip just for that. I did buy an electric car. I occasionally use the back of envelopes, but I do make sure to recycle them. And by the way, don't put the plastic windows into the recycling because it gums up the machinery. You have to actually take out the plastic windows and just put the paper part of the envelope into the recycling bin. Pro tip. I have never reprimanded someone for throwing out a glass thing, not even the kids. I do occasionally correct the kids who put them in the wrong places. Well, okay. We do occasionally save water, and I have cut back on meat, but I am not fully vegetarian, and I absolutely berate people for leaving on lights in the house consistently. So these are all environmental choices that anybody could make, a family could choose to make. You might do sometimes, but they're all options, and they're not mandatory. Now, when we think about our identity as humanistic Jews, we like to try and find connections to both parts of our identity, our Jewish roots and our humanistic philosophy, to motivate us to do good things and to be good citizens in the world. Now, modern environmentalism is not really necessarily related to Judaism in any meaningful way. You can find biblical passages that talk about humanity being in charge of the earth, or if you besiege a city, don't cut down the fruit trees. That's not a lot. There are rabbinic principles that talk about avoiding cruelty to animals, not being wasteful, but we have to realize that the medieval shtetl did not recycle. And there are no major initiatives for environmental consciousness in Orthodox Jewish communities that study Jewish law all the time, be they in Brooklyn or in Bnei Brak in Israel. In fact, in Israel, the Jewish state, they have a major issue with pollution and garbage and litter. The recycling is primarily done by what they call the Anglos, which are the English-speaking Jews who live there from America or Great Britain or Australia. And it's not part of the native culture there, even though it's organized as a Jewish state with a Jewish calendar and Jewish content in the Sunday school and the daily schools. Still, it's not deeply rooted, that environmental consciousness. In fact, the fact that Anglos are the ones that tend to do it suggests it's a surrounding culture thing that found its way into certain Jewish people. There's even a famous rabbinic statement that says, if you're walking on the way studying rabbinic law, and you stop and say, how beautiful is this tree? How wonderful is this brook? It's a sin. Don't get distracted from the law by appreciating nature. We might say, how dare you walk by nature and not appreciate it? So, differing values. Jewishness might not have a deep root in environmentalism, even if we can find connections like Tu B'Shvat, the holiday for trees that we've made into a Jewish environmental holiday, Sukkot as a holiday appreciating nature and farming, and so we can find ways to make connections even if they don't organically spring from that. But environmentalism, when it comes to humanism, is an intimate part of being humanistic. Some of our principles in humanism are that we are responsible to each other. We have to act in consideration of each other. I am not an island. What I do affects other people. And so that implies to affecting the environment that affects other people as well. If you're a responsible person, and we talk about human responsibility as part of our sense of dignity, of being in charge of our own lives, well, if you're responsible, you clean up your mess. Part of our mess is the debris that's left after we eat something, or make something, or use something, or purchase something online that gets brought to our house in something. We also value the application of science and reason to understand the world and to do better, and to use resources wisely, to think about downstream and upstream and how to manage all of those effects. We respond to evidence when it comes to things like climate change and limited resources. But we also need to have a rational evaluation of what's working and what's not working. Like any human problem, there are complicated roots to the problem and complicated solutions to that problem, and nothing is all good. Well, I'm going to share with you a short video about plastics and recycling. And I have to tell you at the outset, the title of this video is Plastic Recycling is a Scam. But it's not produced by the plastics industry. So, did you learn something about plastics and recycling that is very upsetting? It's a problem. And if you actually think about how much single-use plastic you experience in one grocery run, right? Every loaf of bread is in a plastic bag. Every cheese stick is separately in a different plastic bag. We've got little plastic cups we're using for our own egg. Now, fortunately, they have a little, is it a recycling symbol? No, it's a resin identification code on them. But in theory, they could be recycled. Now, this video is a few years old. We can hope that maybe they've gotten beyond just 1 and 2 being recyclable to some of the other numbers, but it's not a guarantee. I did read that the bag recycling that you'll see at grocery stores, it's only again for the ones with that resin identification code on it, usually number 4. I did read that those do actually get recycled in some way. So I'm optimistic that all that time I spent with all the bagel wrappers and the bread bags and the other things that come in the carry-out grocery store. Number 6 does get done, yeah. So hopefully it's getting better at recycling it. But the other thing we have to realize is it's not just about forcing recycling agencies to do it, it's making it make economic sense and changing people's behavior. So here's an example of something that happened in California. Just this last week, there was an editorial in the LA Times about this. You may have seen this. In 2016, the state of California banned single-use plastic bags. You know, all those grocery stores and retailers, you shouldn't have a single-use plastic bag that you take and then you throw away. We actually use it once as a garbage bag. We haven't bought garbage bags in years because we just use those shopping bags for that. But the goal was to ban single-use plastic bags. What they did allow was at a checkout, you could buy a thicker plastic tote bag or a more permanent, canvas tote bag. And those plastic bags that were thicker were designed to be reused up to 125 times before they would then get recycled. And they could cost as little as 10 cents. But the goal was to have at least some of a disincentive, so you'd bring your own, but you would provide plastic bags for 10 cents each. Well, what happened? People simply bought those 10-cent plastic bags and threw those away. Because it was just 10 cents a bag, you get 10 bags, it's $1. Big deal. Did they know what? That they were thicker? Yes. Did they know they were reusable? Probably. They could have tried. But the other thing that happened was the pandemic hit, and then they weren't allowed to bring back bags, and so then it sort of fed its own problem. But the other problem with those big, thicker plastic bags is there is no recycling center in the state of California that will accept them for recycling. So now they got all these thick bags. They can't recycle them. And their behavior, their sort of training, their cultural conditioning is just to use it and throw it away. So it turns out in 2014, California threw out 157,000 tons of plastic bag waste into the trash. That was in 2014. In 2022, 6 years after the ban was in place, they threw out 231,000 tons of trash, 50% more, because the bags were thicker. They were using more plastic. That's the irony. If you buy big plastic garbage bags, because they're thicker, there's more plastic per garbage unit than there would be even if you're using thinner bags. It's one of the reasons why Amazon now says on their cardboard boxes, we use less cardboard per box. And you might think it doesn't add up to much in your boxes, but when you're on Amazon and you're using millions of boxes, it does add up in the end. And even if they only offered paper bags, which the LA Times editorial suggests, let's fix the bag ban, let's make sure you can only offer paper bags, there are still exemptions in the law for restaurants. They can still use plastic bags because, of course, food leaks. Retail stores, they can still use it. Farmers markets, they can still use plastic bags. So even within a bag ban, there's going to be edge cases, limitations, and challenges. Now, I mentioned before that I do drive an electric car. Now, is an electric car more environmental than a gas car? Well, it depends. Now, in my family's evolution, we started in 2005 with a Toyota Prius hybrid. Then in 2013, we shifted to a plug-in hybrid that got about 20 miles on the battery, and the rest was combined gas-electric. And then in 2021, we switched to a full electric car. People thought I was having a midlife crisis because it happened to be a Mustang, but it was a non-Tesla full EV that had good range. That was why I bought it. But also I bought it because the drive quality was really good. And I like the design, and I like the amenities, and all these cool things they've invented in cars, like backup cameras and built-in navigation. A chunk of it was environmentalism, for sure. But like everything, it's complicated. So let's think, what are some of the environmental pluses of an electric car? And then we'll look at some of the minuses, too. So what are some of the pluses of using an electric car? No pollution or emissions. You're not using gasoline or oil. Hey, that's a negative. We're getting to that later. Positives first, negatives second. Fewer emissions, okay. Now, you also have to consider production versus usage, right? And in the usage, we'll explore the question of where does that power come from, right? Because electricity doesn't grow on trees. Okay, so you have no gasoline and oil, you're not using fossil fuels, you're not generating greenhouse gases, the pollution of particulate matter and so on isn't there.
Air filters.
You don't have air, well, you do have an air filter in the car for the cabin quality, but you don't have to deal with the...
I just bought an electric car and I don't have to do anything except take it in every 6 months to rotate the tires.
Well, you have to rotate the tires, but you do have to change the air filter if you don't want to sneeze a lot, at least in my car. No, it's not dealing with the engine affecting the air quality, it's just the world affecting the air quality. Just like in your house, you have an air filter. What?
There is no engine, just the motor.
Okay, because there's no engine, there's just the motor driving it. You don't have belts, you don't have hoses, you don't have spark plugs, you don't have all those little pieces that can break, so therefore, with less moving parts, there's less maintenance that's both cheaper and, in theory, less waste, less machinery that you have to repair. Many electric cars have lasted quite a long time because of that limited moving parts, and that's good. There's a more efficient energy conversion. Converting electric energy into drive is much more efficient than burning gasoline to cause a piston to move to drive the engine. It's more efficient energy to movement conversion in an electric car. So those are some of the positives. Now, what are some of the negatives? Tom mentioned that there are emissions in producing a car. Remember, if you're getting batteries, many of the batteries use rare earth minerals. How do you get rare earth minerals? You have to dig. That requires emissions to produce those, and also many of those rare earth minerals come from conflict zones. And so now you're supporting corrupt governments or gangs or who knows what by the money that you're spending on this. And you have to transport it, and transport also doesn't happen like Star Trek by beaming it somewhere. You have to move it on a ship usually that usually drives by diesel or some other kind of fossil fuel in addition to the extraction. I also mentioned the case of how you get energy to charge the car. Does that come from a coal-fired power plant? Does it come from a nuclear plant? Does it come from wind or solar? Well, then you can maybe adjust it a bit. But of course, even the solar panels have to be produced and take energy to make and have some downstream issues. One other issue with an electric car, yeah?
All your body parts have changes. Some are plastic, some are metal. A lot of them are metal energy going into the body parts.
Well, this is an interesting question. Should I keep my 10-year-old gas car or should I buy a new electric car? Because the 10-year-old gas car was already made. But making the new electric car, you're going to be making the body parts and the other, I think body parts, I think of a person, but the parts of the auto body and so on. One other challenge is electric cars are heavier. Battery's heavier, right? And so what that means is you're wearing the roads more, and your tires wear out faster, and you're releasing more particulate matter from the tires into the water stream and into the ground around the roads and so on. So there are some negatives to it. Now, what's the end result of all this calculus? It turns out that it does take a higher environmental cost to make an electric car than it does to make a gas car. So when they drive off the lot, your carbon cost or your environmental detriment, your demerit list, is higher with an electric battery car than it is with a gas car. However, because of the emissions produced by the gasoline and the oil and all these other pieces, within a few years, the electric car is net better than the gas-only car. It depends on your energy source, again, whether you're talking oil versus, or, like you could have home oil that produces energy, or coal or nuclear versus solar panels, wind, hydropower. Those are cleaner power sources that can make up for your environmental damage a little bit sooner. So this is one sort of case example of the electric car and how it's complicated. There's pluses and minuses, and there's going to be detriments in different places. Plus, if there's a limited amount of these rare earth materials, then at some point, just like with fossil fuels, we're going to have to find new chemical formulations. They're experimenting with new options. Right now, lithium-ion is one of the most common examples, but lithium is relatively rare and takes a lot to manufacture, and there's an environmental cost to the refining process for lithium. But they're experimenting now with potassium ion, and potassium is 1,000 times more prevalent in the world than lithium is, and thus might be cheaper and also have less environmental costs in extracting and producing. So it's going to be a process, and it's going to be many steps, but there's always going to be some trade-offs. So let's think about some of the trade-offs in other environmental initiatives. Wind power. What are some of the pluses? What are some of the minuses? Either side. Bird strikes, right? Migrating birds. Some people think they cause cancer. That has not been proven by any reputable scientist.
Beauty versus noisiness.
Natural beauty versus noise, or the view, right? You could do offshore wind, but then your view is these windmills. I actually think they're very pretty. When I drive through, outstate, it's great. Right. You're still producing the windmill. You've got to replace rotors periodically. They're really big. They do help farmers sometimes because they take a relatively small footprint to produce, and so they can still farm around it. And it's why you see in very rural areas all these wind farms in the middle of fields, and it works fine. So that's some of the positives and negatives of wind energy. But again, it's an emissionless energy in theory. It, a reduced emission, let's say, net of the whole production process, and can provide some clean energy. The other challenge, as people say, is sometimes the wind doesn't blow. Sometimes the sun doesn't shine. So then you either have to add it to the grid in some way, or you find a way to store it. And then you have to come up with clever ways to store it because no battery lasts forever, energy fades. Superconductors maybe, but then those are expensive to produce. There's no magic solution. Another example, nuclear power. It has two major products, steam, which is just water, and nuclear waste. And so, as long as you contain the nuclear waste, you've got an emission-free source of energy. Right, right. So if there's no nuclear... Yeah, you can keep where you keep the nuclear waste is often a debate. They were trying to build this storage unit in Yucca Mountain, I think, in Nevada many years ago, and everybody flipped out about it. They've thought about shooting it into the sun. What could go wrong with that? Although the other problem, of course, is it has to launch. You've got to get it out of the atmosphere first. But again, that's the trade-off of nuclear. Is it's emission-free. If your goal is emissions, you can use nuclear. If you're worried about the aftermath of the nuclear waste, then that's a different problem. Recycling, I'm sorry, you were going to answer? Oh, sorry, online, thank you. I see a comment in the chat now. Taxes from a nuclear power plant funded 100% of my spouse's school system. So there you go. Recycling, right? We've heard about some of the problems with plastic recycling. Well, recycling takes energy. And it often costs more than producing new, as he mentioned with plastic. It's a lot easier to take petroleum and make it plastic than to take plastic and make it into plastic. But if you're recycling products, they need a market. How many people here recycle paper at home? Newspaper, print paper, right? How many of you make a point of buying paper products made from recycled paper? Some do, but they're often more expensive, because it costs money to recycle, or because they are convinced that people who are worried about the environment are willing to spend more to buy the stuff made from recycled paper, so therefore you prove their point by spending the extra money. Once my wife and I were talking about what can we do to be a little bit more environmental in the house, and she said, I think we should buy recycled toilet paper. And I said, Isn't there a limit? What she meant was toilet paper made from recycled paper, which we do, which is fine. So this is one of those questions about choices, but also understanding that this is a market. It isn't just regulation. So you can force the recycling companies to take all that recycling. But if there isn't a market for the products produced by the recycling, then it doesn't make sense for them to stay in business and to do that. If there were a natural market for it, it would work. If you think back in the olden days when you had milk bottles that were glass, it was in the company's interest to reuse them because it was just a lot cheaper. And you could... It was not cheaper than using single-use plastic once that became an option. Right, between loss and breakage. Yeah, absolutely. So when they switched to plastic, they didn't break as often in transport as well as in filling. That's why they switched.
The kids did go hunting for pop bottles and couldn't make nickel back every year. I made $2 or $3 a day.
Well, if you have a deposit law, that does help cleaning up, whether it's cans or bottles. But of course, the deposit laws are also complicated because in Michigan, where I grew up, we had a 10-cent deposit law. It was one of the most generous in the country. But it didn't apply to bottled water. Didn't apply to juice. Didn't apply to iced tea. It was only for soda, or we called it pop, but it was only for carbonated, sugary drinks, which did help with those, and beer.
Its purpose was to eliminate the litter problem.
And the goal was to solve litter, but not recycling.
It ended that problem.
Yes, it did help address that to a great degree. But of course, with all these single-use plastic water bottles, right, versus a refillable bottle. So we have made some progress. You know, you'll see in airports, in public spaces, in high schools, the water bottle refilling stations. So people will use refillable water bottles or even just refill the plastic bottle more than one time. So we have made progress in that front, but that's the challenge with recycling, is it requires the market as well as the law requiring it. What is the most carbon neutral way to buy produce? Now you might think it's your local farmer's market, right? Close from farm to table, you want to minimize the distance. But the challenge is the economies of scale. Michael Pollan in his Omnivore's Dilemma talks about this very clearly. He says that if you have a container ship that's bringing, let's say, tomatoes from Argentina to North America, the carbon per tomato, because it's carrying so many thousands of tomatoes, may be less than the farmer putting 1 bushel of tomatoes in the back of his pickup truck and driving 50 miles to the farmer's market because of the economies of scale. And you think of those diesel trains that are pulling people, right? Riding Metro to downtown is way more economical than taking your own transportation, even though the train is going to produce a lot more than your individual car. But the carbon per person on the train is a lot less than the carbon per person if everyone had a car. So the most economical way to do produce may be the grocery store and not the farmer's market if you're worried about the carbon per tomato or carrot or lettuce. Now, what? Or grow them yourself. Well, then farm to table is yard to table. It's a lot easier. And no need to drive anything to get there, hopefully. Well, you got to deal with the squirrels and rabbits. That's what electricity is for. All right. So now, I want to give you a couple of sources of hope. I presented a lot of challenges, but I want us to think about something more positive. One source of hope is human ingenuity. Remember, we get ourselves into this mess, we can get ourselves out of it. So here are some examples of really clever ideas I've read about. In one pilot project, they're attempting to put water turbines in stormwater drains, so that when it rains and there's a great water and the water is flooding out to the lake, to the ocean, to the sea, the water flowing through those storm drains will turn a turbine and thus produce hydropower that can be added to the grid. As long as it doesn't get jammed, sounds like a great idea. What happens in a hurricane? You get more water, so you get more power. One idea that has been tried and really hasn't worked is what are called solar roads. Trying to embed solar panels in the roadway, because you think the road is exposed to the sun 99% of the time, it would be a great place to do solar. The problem is it's not at the right angle to hit the sun. It gets dirty, and that makes it much less efficient. It just doesn't work. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't work. Now, solar canopies over parking areas, that can work great because it can be angled correctly, it can be tied right into the grid, and it provides shade for the cars so they use less energy to cool down afterwards. In places like Arizona or Nevada, that should be mandatory in any new build is solar canopy work. Just seems automatic. So we can be innovative in other ways. I read an article in National Geographic about using abandoned mines to store energy. Now, the way you do that is not by putting really big batteries in the mines. You use water. You see, water can store what's called potential energy. If you lift up water to a height, that holds energy, and when you let it go down, that can turn a turbine, and that produces energy. So you have a large, deep mine that goes down a mile or two in the ground, and you've got water at the bottom. When you have excess solar or wind energy, you bring the water up to a higher level within the mine, and then when it's nighttime, or the wind isn't blowing, or the sun isn't shining, you release some of that water down, and it turns the turbine. So it's like a natural battery that's storing your energy that you can then use to produce energy without any kind of emissions through that process of simply reusing the water as potential energy. And it doesn't even evaporate that much because it's all underground in the mine. Again, pilot projects are being tested. Interesting ideas are possible. And you've probably already seen around town electric delivery vans by Amazon, for example. They've been buying thousands of Rivian vans. And the post office also is going to be buying more electrical vehicles. And these electric vehicles are perfect for this use case. It's not long distance, it's not hauling a boat, it's not the cases that don't work for electric cars. These are short routes that are known, they're limited distance, and you can slow charge them overnight because you're not doing these deliveries, from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. So you can plug it into a lower speed charger that doesn't require the high speed charging for road trips and make it much more economical in not a delivery lot, but like a storage lot for the vehicles off hours, and that can make it much more effective and efficient and cheap for the businesses that use them. So innovation can help get us out of some of this mess. But we also have to be open to accepting partial measures. Remember those three terms? There was recycle, yes, but there's also reduce and reuse. If you can reduce, it helps. If you don't go vegetarian, eat less meat, eat less beef. That makes a difference. Think about the growth, not just of battery electric cars, which are still increasing the proportion of the car market, albeit slower than expected, but the great growth in hybrid vehicles, which use a battery for some driving assistance and for low speeds, or battery plug-in hybrids that do battery for part and then gas for the rest. Those produce better mileage, and they have smaller batteries. So the same amount of battery that I have in my electric car could power 5 plug-in hybrids, or 20 conventional hybrids for the same amount of battery. And if there's negatives with the batteries, with the minerals and the cost to produce them and the weight and everything else, well, if you have smaller batteries and more cars, then maybe you're helping more people. This is an argument that Toyota has made when they're slow-walking electric cars compared to Ford or GM or certainly Tesla, Rivian, these new startup companies. Well, Toyota's argument is we can do more for the environment by putting a hybrid battery in every car than making only 10% of the cars battery electric.
There's one problem.
The problem?
Shortage, and they raised the prices. I wanted to buy a RAV4. Couldn't find one for under $7,000.
Yes. Well, so there are definitely production issues and priority issues. If Toyota really wanted to sell a lot of those cars, they would. But because they're producing limited numbers, they're keeping the prices high. But remember, they're in business to stay in business. So that's unfortunately also the case in this example as well.
Maybe everybody knows about this already. Of course, we have ComEd here providing all of our power, but you can actually source from renewables through them.
Yes. Even if you don't put solar panels on your own home, you can source through solar producers, even through your existing utility hookup in the North Shore.
More and more of them, and their unit costs are coming down.
Yeah.
Just be careful.
Yes.
Because I did that, because I got my electric car, I started to actually, I did it like 3 or 4 years ago, didn't get any attention to it. And I got my electric car, and I started to look at my bill, and they're charging me twice as much as I do.
Yeah, the problem with a lot of those intro rates is that they then go up. You have to keep an eye on your monitoring. So I wanted to share just a couple final ideas, and we have plenty of time to chat at our own. I know I'm standing between you and dessert and sweet things, and I shouldn't do that for much longer. Amazon using less cardboard in their boxes, doing composting and effective recycling can make a difference because you're reducing garbage in the landfill. You see, people think landfills break down. They don't. The landfill just sits there because it's largely underwater or underground. There's no air coming in. They don't want to turn it up because then it becomes unstable and begins to fall down. And so the less that goes in the landfill, the better. That's the reduce part. Whether it's plastic or food waste or newspaper, you might think the paper breaks down. It doesn't break down. You can do cores where they do like sampling out of garbage dumps, and you can find newspapers from the 1950s that are still there in the dump. Don't put it in the garbage, put it in the recycling. I much prefer to see houses that have a small garbage bin and a big recycling bin than a big garbage bin and a small recycling bin. There's an old rabbinic saying that it's not upon you to complete the task, but you're also not allowed to desist from the task either. Ultimately, environmentalism is connected to our humanism. We focus on what's good for human beings, human needs, and human thriving. Well, a world that works, a world that exists, a world that thrives is good for us. It also demonstrates our focus on human power and responsibility. We are in charge of our own lives. And so we have to make choices that affect the world, and our choices can affect the world for better or for worse. It's up to us what we do. And the more we know, the wiser choices we can make. So I'll end with this story I told in one of our earliest high holiday services. I did it called Hadash, so hopefully those who were here forgot it already. A young man came up to his rabbi, and he thought he was being very clever. He had a bird in his hand, but only one of his hands, and he held out both hands to the rabbi. And he said to the rabbi, "I have in my hands a bird. Is the bird alive or dead?" The rabbi said to himself, "Well, if I say the bird is dead, he'll open his hand and the bird will fly away. If I say that the bird is alive, he'll squeeze his hand, crush the bird, and the bird will be dead." So the rabbi smiled to himself and said to the young man, "That bird in your hand, is it alive or dead? The choice is up to you."